So this chapter is focused on credibility. What's going on here? Well, we're in the information age these days, and we have access to all kinds of information. Back when I was, way back when, going to school, we actually had, in order to do research, we had to go to the library. You ever been there? Stacks of books. You walk down, you might find the book, you might not, you know. And you had to actually search. It was like this big, lost and found thing. You're trying to rummage through the back aisles of these libraries in order to find books. Now, you don't have to leave your sofa. You can go online and get access to all kinds of information. I'll get to you in a second. And also, when I was in school, way back in the 70s and 80s, our news came from 3 major network newscasts: ABC, CBS, and NBC. And the news was given to us at 6:30, and that was it. That was all. That was all the news that you got. You get a little half hour in there, and that was it. Nowadays, how has that changed? How has that changed? 24/7, we can get the news anytime on cable. Whatever's going on, CNN has somebody live right there. And so do 3 other cable channels, all covering it from their different perspectives too. And in order to do research, all you need to do is Google it. And you can go and get all kinds of actual textbooks online, research available online, encyclopedias available online. So we have access now to unlimited amounts of information. And now the question becomes, what part, or how can we distinguish in this information between truth and opinion? How can we distinguish where the real facts are and where we're just getting somebody's opinion or their spin on the issues? And so with access to all this information, the issue of credibility becomes central. How can we determine the credibility of the information that we gain access to in this information age? That's the question that we want to try to address in this chapter. Comment or question, Caleb?
I was wondering, if you have the same research topic as your peers, you're all competing to the library. Do you have to race there to find the same book?
That used to be an issue. There are stories that in some law schools, students would go get the important book and take it out so nobody could get it. And that way you can do better research. And there were some places where it actually got hardcore competitive about that kind of thing. Nowadays it'd be more difficult because you're usually going to have different kinds of access to that information. Maybe that's a good thing if you're in your 3rd year of law school with a bunch of other competitive students in there with you. But here, when we get access to more and more information, the issue about the credibility of that information becomes very, very important. If you just have somebody researching their property on Wikipedia or something, oh, this property is worth this much. I saw it on the internet. Well, must be true then. It becomes dangerous. If you go out to the internet and you get information that is false or misleading, and you use that in your presentation at business, if you use that to try to sell your home, use that to try to convince your girlfriend to marry you or something, you're going to get yourself into trouble. And so you need to be able to determine the credibility of the information provided. Yes, sir?
That may be so, but if you ever get an instant message from disavowed nobility from a distant land offering to put vast sums of money in your bank account, you should just jump on that opportunity, because those are rare.
Absolutely. And that brings us to one of the issues discussed in the book, now there are all kinds of fraud on the internet. They call it phishing, where they put out little requests like that, trying to get somebody's money, and if you just blanket email a bunch of people, you can probably count on there being a few idiots who will send the money. And they have more devious things. This one they talked about, 419 fraud. One example of it is when they send you an email with an official looking panel on it that looks like your bank. And they say that there's a problem with your bank account and we need to straighten this out. So if you would go to this web page that looks a lot like your bank web page, and it asks you to provide this personal information that we need to straighten out this problem with your account. Well, this personal information goes right to where they can use it to steal money from your credit cards and from other things. And so be aware of this kind of thing, phishing for information. They actually have this happening so often that they gave it a term, 419 fraud. And so you're looking at this email and you're thinking, oh, that looks credible. It has the Bank of America insignia right up there, so it must be true. And they use that to get your information. Then worse than that, in this book they tell this story about, I think it was a relative of one of the authors, uncle or brother or cousin, something like that. And he met a woman over the internet who lived in Mexico or something like that. And they sparked up this relationship online. And he goes to visit her, and he gets killed and his money stolen. And once again, you start this relationship up, the person seems credible, they act in certain ways, but they use that apparent credibility in order to get information and money from you. So when the king of Dubai sends you an email, or some other, if it's too good to be true, it's too good to be true. Yes, ma'am.
My son applied online, and somebody hired him as a personal secretary. Then he sent him a money order, 2 money orders for about $2,000. In order for him to bring money orders to his bank and cash the money and send in Washington State or somewhere to a orphanage, wedding in English. So my son did. I said, this is too good to be true. But be careful. He gave all his information. I don't know what we have to do, but he got the money he sent. He paid him $500 in the 2000, so he sent $1,500. After that, he sent him another cashier check for $5,000 to do the same transaction.
Ouch.
Then when he brought the cashier check to the bank, the federal said the cashier check was not valid. Then they went back and said that the money orders
they aren't valid either.
They were not needed. So my son has to reimburse
Ouch.
the 2,000.
Ouch.
I said, no, you should have seen that the money orders were not valid.
Right.
You know, the financial document, he doesn't. He brought them to the bank. So you guys have to take it. Oh no, that was a how do you call it? Fraud or something. He has to take care. He has to pay.
The bank isn't going to help you.
Yeah. Then I went to know if what is a legal action to take or
with the small
writing.
things,
Yeah.
it's difficult.
Then they say no, he has to pay.
Wow. And in these cases, if it's small sums of money, you take it to court, it costs as much money to take it to court as probably what you'll get from some of these things. So in reality, it's hard to get justice in these small cases.
And because these cases have been at the court already, and the result was that the person has to pay, because the person, the bank said he should have waited to see that the money orders were cleared before he took the money and sent. So because of that, he has to pay.
Ouch. Let that be a lesson to everybody. Don't give money over the internet. And generally, your bank is not going to ask you for personal information in the email over the internet for that very reason. They're aware of people committing this kind of fraud, and they don't want to be associated with it themselves. Now, a couple things about credibility. First, the difference between an interested and a disinterested party. Generally, interested parties are not going to be as credible as disinterested parties. And what do we mean by this? Well, an interested party would be, for example, somebody who works at BP who's asked about the effects of the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. If that person works for BP and they get a check from this company, you might think that the information they provide is going to be colored by that influence. And they'll try to look for things that don't make the company look as bad. As opposed to, say, talking to a professor who works at LSU. You might argue that that person would be maybe interested on the other side. They've seen their culture and their society destroyed by this environmental catastrophe, and they might be looking for ways in which the company has done worse. And so the first thing we're going to look at in terms of judging the credibility of a source is whether the person is an interested or a disinterested party. And disinterested parties are going to be considered more credible. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to reject what comes from an interested party. You're just going to be skeptical, and you're going to try to provide or find other sources to confirm that information. It's an interested party. You don't reject it completely, but you're going to have to be skeptical. And keep this in mind when we get later, because we'll talk about one fallacy called ad hominem. And ad hominem fallacy is where you don't find a problem with the argument, you find a problem with the person offering the argument, and you use that as a way to reject the argument. Well, strictly speaking, logically, that is not a valid move. You should be able to evaluate the merits of an argument regardless of whose mouth it comes out of. And whose mouth it comes out of is actually going to be irrelevant to the logical structure of the argument itself. So when we're judging the validity and the strength of an argument, we should be able to consider that in the absence of any facts about the person. But when that person is providing us information and that person happens to be an interested party, we have to at the very least be skeptical of the information we get from them. Yes, ma'am?
When you say find a problem with the person, do you mean like I don't like their hair? Or
Yeah. For example, President Obama's come out with the new jobs bill. President Obama sucks. Have you seen what he's done for the past 2.5 years? Clearly this job bill can't work. That's ad hominem. That is arguing against the person and using that argument against the person to undermine the belief in this argument. And that will be what we call an ad hominem fallacy. However, they're getting a little bit close to it here when they ask us to look into whether a source is an interested or a disinterested party. And when they get to the ad hominem discussion, they'll admit how this is a bit of a tension, where when we're judging the validity of an argument, we should be able to ignore the person offering the argument. But when we're judging the credibility of information, we have to take the person into account, and particularly whether they're an interested or a disinterested party.
what if you find a problem with the person that's kind of like valid? Like he doesn't have enough experience in this field, or
Absolutely.
is that okay?
Yes. Now that will lead us to question the information. Let's say we're looking into the BP oil spill and we're talking to this scientist, but we find that the scientist doesn't have a degree in environmental science, actually has a degree in space architecture. We'll say, you know, that's great, you got a degree, but you don't have a degree in the field. And actually say that because this guy wrote a book that is anti-climate change, and he's not an environmental scientist, he's actually this professor of space architecture. And you can legitimately question whether he has the skills to decipher all this information, since this isn't his profession. So you would be skeptical of the information you get from this source. However, if that guy offers an argument, we should still be able to evaluate it on its merits, independent of the fact he might not know what he's talking about. So it's a very interesting line we have to walk. We need to judge the credibility of information, and in order to do that, we have to take the background information of the source into account. But when we get to evaluating logical arguments, we need to be able to ignore the person who offered the argument and judge the argument on its merits. And the reason I'm taking some time on this is because the two ideas come into tension a little bit, a little difficult. Now, one way we judge the credibility of information is by evaluating and comparing it to our background information on the topic. We all have information about a lot of topics. And when we hear a claim, our first intuitive thing to do is to compare it with what we know on that topic. And you see it all the time in class. Kind of, he just said something and I compare it against what I know on that topic. And a claim is going to lack credibility when it conflicts with what we know about the topic. And I think in the book they talk about how, palm trees grow really good at the North Pole. Palm trees grow real well at the North Pole. Well, what do we know about the North Pole? It used to be cold up there, and there used to be snow and glaciers, and it's all melting. And heck, there could be palm trees growing now, for all we know. No, generally we know at the North Pole it's too cold for palm trees, and so when somebody says they've got a bunch of palm trees growing at the North Pole, we're going to be skeptical of this information because it conflicts with the background information we have about the North Pole. When we're judging the credibility of information, we need to be careful not to be distracted by irrelevant considerations. Like, for example, the physical characteristics, the gender, the age, the ethnicity, the accent, and mannerisms of the people offering an argument. These are going to be irrelevant. And so we need to be skeptical when we hear this incredibly confident man on the insurance commercials, Allstate, this guy, are you in good hands? He just makes you feel comfortable, whatever is going on. And he is picked for that very reason. How many actors did they go through to get this one guy who makes you feel like he's the president of the world? And he makes you feel confident.
Well, I'm sure they wanted Morgan Freeman, but obviously he has too much integrity for that.
He's too known, and he does all those comedies. This guy's better than Morgan Freeman, I would suggest. Better. Are you in good hands? I know, I'm telling you. But he's good. In fact, I saw him on in a Clint Eastwood movie where he, Absolute Power, he plays a Secret Service agent protecting the president, who shoots this woman who's having violent sex with the president. And he plays like the Prince of Death. He's the guy that'll put you under whoever. And it's amazing because he's the guy with good hands, and now I'm the guy who's going to put you in there. He even made me feel comfortable when he was doing that. Don't worry, I'll kill him. I think that was even a line. I'll kill him. I've got good hands. So, in these commercials, they pick all these irrelevant considerations. They get the person with the right gender, the right age, the right ethnicity to appeal to the largest group, to all get you to say yes, buy this insurance. So these are irrelevant considerations with respect to the credibility of the information you get. And in a commercial, this guy is saying whatever they write on the teleprompter, you know. And so what comes out of his mouth has been carefully designed to get us to buy stuff. And for that reason, the authors of our text are going to encourage us to be skeptical of all the information we get from advertisements. And don't let these irrelevant considerations affect your view of the argument being made. And in many cases, this will be difficult to do. For example, Rick Perry recently had difficulty pointing out some problems with Mitt Romney. And he wanted to try to show that he was a flip-flopper. And Rick Perry tried to say, well, I need to find the right Mitt Romney. Was that the Mitt Romney that was for or before he was for Obamacare before he was against it? And was that the one who was for? No, he was against the Second Amendment before he was for it. And is that the one who was calling, and he just got lost, man. And he might have had a point in there, but he forgot it. He walked all over it. He didn't get it out with the rhythm. And now, how would another more gifted politician say that? Oh, well, imagine, you know, Jesse Jackson or some of these guys. You know, you get the crowd going and you'd say it in rhythm and it even rhymed, you know? Oh my goodness, it rhymes. And so the point would be sunk home, and even if it isn't true, I've said it so well that people believe me. You know? And there are people who can do that. You know? Say it in a way that has rhythm, that makes sense, and makes people believe it even if it isn't true. And sometimes it's just being able to say the words in a rhythmic way without stumbling all over yourself. Now, unfortunately, you know, stumbling all over your words when you speak, that's not a logical problem with an argument. That's a problem with your ability to say the argument. Now, many will argue that's an irrelevant consideration. The point that Rick Perry was making might well have been a valid point. And the fact that he stumbled all over it, that really shouldn't affect our evaluation of the point he was trying to make. Nevertheless, it does, doesn't it?
Well, on the Daily Show, they're playing some footage of that. They showed one CNN commentator saying that Perry threw up all over himself. Essentially, that was how bad it was. But
nerves might have been involved.
It was definitely Perry's own contradictions are pretty glaring as well. He's
absolutely,
he's pro-life, but he's executed more people than any other governor ever, and you know, they're even in the base, the audience was cheering for that, and you know, the Republicans are ostensibly against these fictitious death panels, but then when someone said, the question was, do you think coma patients should just be allowed to die? And we have people cheering, "Yeehaw!" Woo! No,
our own death panel right in the audience.
Right, right. I think it's the base is worse than the Kennedys.
The base is not going to be elected president.
And these guys aren't even, this is not their real names. It's James Perry and Willard Romney. How can you trust them to say anything if they're lying about who they are?
Well, one of the most credible forms of information that we can get, supposedly, is personal observation. Personal observation. When we see something, we can be pretty sure about the credibility of the information that we have about it. It is, however, not infallible. Just because we see something doesn't mean that we have interpreted it accurately. And there are mistakes. In medicine, there are cases where they've cut off the wrong leg. And now, when you go in, they write things, not this one, over there, And they really obviously want to take care to be sure about this because mistakes are made, Big, honking, massive mistakes are made. I just thought it was the left leg. I'm sorry. Sorry. Sorry.
You're
That
left
won't
over my.
cut it, will it? Sorry. Say that to my attorney. And our beliefs, our fears, our expectations, they all influence what we see and how we interpret it. They influence what we see and how we interpret it. They did these psychological experiments where I have a deck of cards and I'm going to show you these cards one by one. And you just get 1 second to look at them. Now I'm not going to tell you, but in this deck we have some anomalous cards. For example, I have a red 3 of spades. A red 3 of spades in this deck. And as I show Maddow, Rachel. Maddow, as I go through here and we get to the red 3 of spades, what's she going to call it?
3 of hearts.
Yes, because that's what she expects. It looks close to a 3 of hearts, and I know there's no anomalous cards in this deck, so I'm going to interpret it as the closest thing that I'm expecting. It happens all the time. You call it a red 3 of hearts until I tell you that there are some anomalous cards in this deck, some funky stuff going on, and then you'll keep an eye out and you are in a better position to see that anomalous card. So what you actually see and what you focus on, that is influenced by your expectations, your hopes, your fears, and sometimes when you want to see something, you kind of make yourself see it. Yes, sir?
Kind of like the Moonwalking Bear video.
I'm afraid to ask about the
It's like-
Moonwalking Bear video.
There are 2 basketball teams, and it's one's black, one's white, and it says count the number of passes. There's a dude in a bear suit that walks by and does the moonwalk, and the first time I saw it, I was like you're supposed to count the passes, and after the video, it's did you catch the moonwalking bear? And most people are like, what? And then they re-show it, and it's clear as day.
Because you are focused on the passes and you're not focused on the bear. So the idea is that the white guys pass it more? Is that
Well, it's not. It's team wearing white shirts, team, and it's just count the number of the team, the white team passes or whatever.
That's what magicians do. They distract you. Here, look over here. Meanwhile, over here, I'm doing all this stuff. Distraction. And you can do that in arguments as well. Distract people with some issue over here and then slip in a conclusion over there before you really consider the relationship.
It seems in politics they do a lot of that with emotional and distract people with
Big time.
high emotional temperature issues.
Yeah, we don't have jobs, so let's all get angry at the immigrants who are coming in to take your jobs, rather than the corporations that aren't providing them, other things like that. You can scapegoat, focus people on a false cause of their problems. So our beliefs, our hopes, our fears, our expectations are going to influence our personal observations. So these personal observations are not going to be infallible. We can be wrong. And in that recent capital case where the gentleman was put to death in Georgia, we had 7 of the 9 witnesses recant their story. 7 out of 9 recant their story. These were people who had personal observations that contributed to the guilt of that man. Now they've changed their story. We have to reconsider the credibility associated with personal observations. These people can be wrong, and apparently the police can influence people. Oh, this is the guy, that's the guy. And so, your expectations, your hopes are going to lead you to say that that is the guy.
Wasn't there like no DNA either?
No DNA, and apparently there was some gentleman who confessed to the crime and was threatening some of the witnesses. And one witness left the state for her own protection. So, big honking reasonable death.
It's very likely that the police were also intimidating the witnesses
This
because
is what I've heard.
it was a cop who was murdered, and they just needed someone to fry for it.
They have a special feeling about cases that involve cops. They want to solve them, hold the person accountable, and that's understandable, but we need to get the right guy. And it is relevant, given the way Perry was applauded for his use of capital punishment. There are 2 people in Texas, in his state right now, that the Supreme Court is reviewing their case. And so there's some questions. There are some questions.
Harry wants to be the guy with the red button with all the all our nukes. He presses too many buttons already. I think what was the question he dodged? It was like, have you ever stayed an execution? And he completely dodged that.
Brian Williams asked him if he ever felt guilty for putting an innocent person to death, and he didn't even address that question. When we now feel in Georgia this might have just happened. And I think we've talked before about how in Illinois they imposed a moratorium on the death penalty. We talked about Illinois last time. In Illinois, the students at Northwestern universities in their journalism school, the students took on a project, this is a few years ago, where they investigated the cases of those on death row. And these students went out and they got DNA evidence and they investigated these cases in great detail. And they found that a number of these people on death row were innocent, and they could prove it using DNA evidence. And the number that they could prove to be innocent got to be so large that the governor of the state, who was a conservative, a Republican, who was leaving office as a result of scandal, but on his way out of office, he imposed a moratorium. And he generally made the case that if my prosecutors are only batting 500, that is not good enough to use the death penalty. We should not even risk putting an innocent person to death, because you can't fix them. Yes, sir.
I read the book, someone said, like, you asked a question, would you rather kill an innocent person or let a guilty murderer walk free? And they said, I'd rather kill an innocent person, which is the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my entire life.
And it's really a false choice, because
Because if you kill an innocent person, then you're also technically letting a guilty murderer free.
that, and we don't have to choose between letting somebody go free and killing them. We can put people away life in prison without parole. And for many people, that's worse than death, And that can always be corrected. You can't make it as if it never happened, but you can always, let the guy out. And there's even some question as to whether the death penalty would deter crime more than life in prison without parole with Bubba. For many, that is a bad, bad thing. And if that does not deter you from crime, you are so high on crack that nothing's going to deter you from crime, So many would actually question whether we gain anything by putting people to death. And you add on top of that, here's the weird thing. Guess what costs more? To kill them, yeah. All these appeals and everything, it ends up putting somebody to death actually costs more than just letting them stay for life in prison. And so when you add up the costs and everything, it's really, it might make some people feel good, but there are some other issues involved. Yeah?
Definitely, you can't trust the lawyer credibility, because obviously the state lawyers are 10 times better than any the lawyers they give you. Where do they find those lawyers?
And they, the public defenders, they've got all these cases, they can barely take time to look at yours. Meanwhile, people who are wealthy, they can get a dream team and have one guy, I'm just focused on this area, this guy's focused in this area. And many would argue that if you can put enough money behind your legal defense, you can actually strengthen your case. I mean, just having a lawyer goes a long way. I remember I had to go to court one time. This is on film, I have to be careful here. And I had an attorney help me out, and there were a lot of people there who didn't. And this one guy gets up and he has this offense, and while he's explaining himself, he confesses to being a part of a crime earlier. It's like, man, just shut up. You would do really well to keep your mouth shut. And my attorney, on the other hand, he does all the talking. The first thing he says as we walk up to the judge, and he goes, "Oh, you've lost some weight." They're friends, they go to the campouts, so they go into the back room, they work out my deal, and the only communication between me and the judge is an approving nod. That's what an attorney, can
How
get
much
you.
you have to pay?
Like $1,000 for the attorney.
What did you do?
What's that?
What did you do?
It was driving related. And, but the point is that people who have the money to get the attorney to defend them, they're going to be in a stronger position than those people who don't have the money, have to accept a public defender who's so very busy, blah, blah, blah. So money has an influence on our legal system, most definitely. Now, when judging the credibility of information, another thing we look at is background information. I mentioned this before. I know that palm trees do not grow in abundance near the North Pole. I have background information that it's pretty cold up there at the North Pole, and so if somebody says this, I'm going to question it, because it's inconsistent with the background information I have on the topic. And you can imagine a number of examples of this, where somebody makes a claim and is simply inconsistent with the background information you have about that area. I'm trying to think of examples. My head's filled with football for some reason these days. That does not help. So we get an initial view of the plausibility of a claim by simply comparing it with the background information we have, and also judging the background information we have about the source, whether the source is an interested or a disinterested party, for example. And generally, we're going to have a kind of scale of plausibility. When we hear a claim, we're going to do these tests, judge it against our background information. We're going to make some judgments about the credibility of the person, and we're going to have an initial scale of plausibility. And in class, people make claims all the time, and that's how I suspect students judge that idiot says stupid things all the time. So they're going to have a low scale of plausibility for things that come out of his mouth. But somebody else, going to make sense usually. This one claim seems to be one that is consistent with the background information you have on the topic, so your initial test of plausibility will say that it's fairly plausible. Now, to give you an example of interested and disinterested parties and the difference between them. In the book, they talk about the Iraq War and the information that we received from this man, Ahmad Shalabi. This man, he was an interested party. He had run businesses in Iraq, and he had a personal interest in the country allowing capitalism to run free. And he had a personal interest in a kind of, revolution in the country where the present leaders no longer had the influence that they did at the time. So he was an interested party. We should have had doubts about the credibility of the information that we received from them. And we can have doubts about the credibility of information along two lines. First, we could have doubts about whether the source has real knowledge, for example, of what's going on in Iraq. Some people, you can imagine, just say things and they've never even been to the country or haven't been there recently. And so we could question whether they have real knowledge about the subject. But we could also grant that they do have real knowledge about what's going on in Iraq, but they might not be truthful about it. This guy might want for his business to be successful. So he might simply share the information that'll lead Americans to bring about the revolution that he wants because it serves his interests. And so he might have real knowledge about what's going on in Iraq, but he might only share the information that supports his interests because he's an interested party. Yes, sir?
Wouldn't another issue be the person receiving the information as well as being interested?
Absolutely. The people who share that information, they can color it as they do. And so each person in that chain becomes a source with new questions of credibility. So in evaluating credibility, we need to look at the education, the experience, the accomplishments, the reputation, and position. But we also need to acknowledge that the position can indicate a bias. And if the position shows that the person is an interested party, that might lead us to evaluate the credibility of that information differently. So using the case we talked about before, you can have a person who's helping understand the consequences of the BP oil spill. And this person might, for example, have a PhD in environmental science focused primarily on water and pollution in water. Could have, a PhD, published many books on the subject, and attended many conferences where he was the star, or she, the star speaker. And that would all enhance the credibility of the information coming from this source. But then, if we added to that the person has been working for BP for the past 15 years and receives $250,000 in salary to head up their science department, we would have to take that into account as well, and that would make the source an interested party, and that would force us to be more skeptical about the information we receive from the source. Questions? Comments? Yes, sir.
Should not Dick Cheney's membership or affiliation with Halliburton have been taken into account before the unanimous congressional decision to invade Iraq?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't know where that fits in, but that certainly makes the vice president an interested party. Any other questions, examples? All right. Now, the news media. Well, we're going to have fun with this. The authors do. The authors do. And when we get into the subsequent chapters, you'll find that the authors of our textbook added new chapters on fallacies because they saw these fallacies being used on all these cable news networks. And they're making such great use of all these different fallacies that the authors believe they needed to spend more time looking at that problem. So here we are taking into account that we're in a new age. We now have all kinds of news presented to us, not only from 3 networks at 6:30 or 7 o'clock, but multiple networks are providing us news over the cable channels 24/7, 365, all the time, and from multiple perspectives even. A couple issues. According to the authors, one serious concern is the way these news networks are owned by multinational corporations. And it used to be the case that we very tightly regulated the ownership of our news agencies. And the federal government played a much more proactive role in ensuring that there was not a kind of corporate influence over the airwaves with respect to the news. But now, many of these regulations have been relaxed, and right now, the news is owned by, the 5 largest corporations are Time Warner, and let me see here. Comcast now owns NBC. So Comcast now owns NBC. ABC used to be owned by Disney. I'm not sure who owns them now, ABC. And CBS, who owns CBS? Is it Viacom? And of course, Fox is owned by News Corp. This has an impact. This has an impact. For example, for a while, before Comcast bought NBC, NBC was owned by GE. And while GE owned NBC, a news story emerged that GE paid no taxes last year. And at a time when they're thinking about raising taxes on everybody else, this was pretty unusual. And a lot of people kind of were concerned about this. Now, folks from GE will explain that they've lost hundreds of millions of dollars the year before, and those losses offset some of their tax burden. So it was, in their view, a product of the fact that they lost so much money the year before. However, what was very interesting is the way the different news agencies handled the issue. On CBS, ABC, a whole segment on GE, why they don't pay taxes, why other companies are in that same situation, how it's a problem we need to deal with. What did NBC do to cover this issue while they're owned by GE? They had a short segment where they allowed the president of GE to explain why he was not angry that the journalist asked this question. Oh, that's fine that they ask questions like that. We want to provide information to the public. Didn't explain anything about paying no taxes. Didn't really address the question, and allowed the president to have airtime and kind of look good. Well, think about that. That gives you a glimpse of how they're pulling the chains behind, the screen and covering issues that serve their interests or not covering issues that serve their interests. And if it is so obvious when it happens in terms of GE paying taxes, well, you need to ask yourself, how is the news being affected by multinational corporations in ways that we don't notice. Now, for example, right now, Obama had the temerity to ask corporations and the wealthy to pay more in taxes. And I don't know if you've noticed, but there's people's heads exploding on TV these days, doing backflips to try to make that look like a bad idea, although 65 to 70% of the people support it. And you'll find that rich people really don't care what you think. If they can get their view through, they will. And you know, keep your eye on that issue and the way the polls show that people support it, and watch if those poll numbers don't go down over time, as rich people have the ability to use the airwaves to get their point out, specifically these multinational corporations that own the news, which, by the way, would probably like their taxes to stay low. Caleb?
Clearly, we should all just throw the television, throw the TVs away. It is the most, it seems like one of the most effective and pervasive mind control methods. I noticed how they completely cut out any news of like conflict around the world, or actually human rights issues, or anything I want to see, like anything I really like. I want to know right now, like what is happening in Darfur. You know, or
Well, we had to squeeze in that clip from the Charlie Sheen roast. You know, you gotta have time for
Right.
that. And a bunch of other mindless news that distracts us from the real issues at hand, you could argue. And then we've got our Storm Tracker 8 will show that it might actually rain next week. Oh my God! So we're gonna freak you out, you know, about the little stuff, and all by way of distracting you and keeping you watching our news channel rather than the one next door. Yes, ma'am?
I always wonder why corporations don't want to pay what they're supposed to pay and come out and say we give money to charity. Pay money first for the tax. Then if you want to give to charity, give to charity. Why do they give money for to the lobbyists and they don't pay taxes? Give what is necessary to produce what is good for the whole country instead of just, if you give that money, you pay the taxes, lobbyists will still get money.
Good point. And I think that the way the tax system has been set up, they get tax write-offs for many of these charitable donations. So they're going to give to charity because it helps them save money on their taxes. And in fact, one of the things that Obama wants to do is take away those loopholes that enable people to give to charities and not have to pay taxes. I'm pretty sure they save money on their taxes by giving to charitable donations. Yes, sir?
The charity, the taxes is no one-for-one collar.
It isn't?
Is it?
I don't know. I have not offset my taxes by giving to charities, I'll admit to you. But that is one way I know that corporations reduce their tax burden by giving to charities, and then they can write that off on their taxes. Yes, ma'am?
If it's done the same way, I think the money that goes to charity, they just deduct to the amount that they have to tax you.
Then it would be one for one if they just deduct.
No, it's not one for
No.
one. For example, if you make 100,000, that's your base to be taxed. Then they deduct the money you give to charity, and then if you give like 5,000, then your tax will be on 95,000. So that's the portion of tax that 5,000 would have paid is not the same as 5,000. I don't know if you. It's just a little portion of tax of that money you give to charity that you don't pay.
So when you give money to the charity, that reduces by a dollar amount the money that you have to pay taxes on from the
Yes.
income.
Like when we give money to church, so you just deduct that amount to your base. It's not that you have to pay 10,000 for taxes and they deduct that 5,000 over the no. It's just.
Now, this is one of the issues that they're debating. I'm pretty sure that President Obama is right now considering taking away those ways to write off your taxes, to reduce your tax burden. He wants to make it so everybody pays, and the government doesn't come in and tell you to give to these charities. And many on the conservative or the libertarian side will argue that we should determine the charities that we want to donate to, and we shouldn't do it in order to write off our taxes. We should just pay our taxes and give to charities where we feel it's appropriate. So those write-offs are one of the issues that are being debated right now in our country. So we about out of time, and we'll pick it up again on Thursday, talking about the news media and the credibility of the information they provide. Kill the camera there.